morning. Welcome to this very special and secret round of this tournament. My name is Andre, and we have next to me Judita. And we're going to be judging today. This is going to be our wonderful timekeeper. Let me explain it to you. Let's see if everyone hears that. Right? It's standard timekeeping, once before, once at 1 minute, once at 7 minutes, twice when you have to stop at 8 minutes. Then it starts getting annoying. For the replies, it bangs once at 3 minutes and twice when you have left. So it's pretty standard. Okay. That being said, I would like to invite the first speaker of the proposition, Jana, to start the case.
Vitaly Klitschko is a Ukrainian boxing legend, but now he's fighting for something new. He's on the fight for democracy. As an emerging leader of the revolution, he claims that 3 things can unite the Ukrainians. 1, the dismal economic situation. 2, the need for European integration. And 3, the struggle against the authoritarian regime. However, full EU membership can fix all of this and much more. You could say it's the knockout punch to all of Ukraine's problems. In fact, it'll solve everything from conflict to rights abuse to economic woes. And it's for this reason that we, on Team Proposition, propose the motion that this House believes that the European Union should set Ukraine on the road to full membership despite the roar of the Russian bear. Our model is as follows. On February 27th, the European Parliament endorsed a resolution saying that Ukraine will always have the right to apply for membership, meaning that right now, Ukraine is on the path to European Union membership. And yes, it's going to be a slow journey, but this is to ensure that all the proper reforms needed in order to make Ukraine a strong nation will be implemented to the fullest, ensuring that there's transparency in their government and in turn making their government system as strong and as prosperous as it can possibly be. Historically, the European Union has never so explicitly endorsed a country and then rejected it when it turned out for application of membership, meaning that we are currently defending the process that is going on right now. The European Union needs to keep a future alive in which it uses Ukraine as one of its member states, and that's something we must remember as key to looking at today's debate. In order, hence, the burden on the proposition side of today's debate is to show that being on this path, this road to EU membership, benefits the well-being of all Ukrainians. And hence, to prove this point, Team Opposition has 3 strong arguments, the first 2 of which I will cover in my speech, and the latter of which will be covered in our second speech today. The first argument includes the crushes conflict, the second, the abolition of workers' abuse, and lastly, how it will energize the economy of the Ukrainians. Now on to our first point, looking at the crushing of the conflict. Now we have to make sure that we lend legitimacy to the Ukrainian government, because this, in essence, put Russia on the ropes. And right now, the post-revolutionary government of Ukraine is struggling to gain legitimacy, mainly due to the fact that former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych is saying that he's not recognizing it as a proper government, calling them bandits, stealing the government in illegitimate fashions. And while this is clearly propaganda, it does have the potential to implement a seed in the minds of many Ukrainians that could blossom into discontent. The Ukrainian people want a democracy, and so far they haven't necessarily seen that. In fact, if this blossoms into something much devastating, this could be the second revolution, as some analysts call, as we saw in Egypt. This is why they need to establish their legitimacy, and why it's important that they do establish this legitimacy, something that we need to make sure is important, because right now their government has good intentions. In fact, on May 25th, in just a couple of months, they're going to hold their first free election, ensuring that Ukraine as a whole is going to see this notion of transparency as a whole. Their government has good intentions. This is one of the quickest ways to overturn from a revolutionary state to a free election state. And this is showing their true intentions, pure intentions of making sure that there's a benefit on the whole. However, Russia says that however, when we look at this, we have to see that it's actually legitimizing the government as all. Because right now, the European Union stands on principles of peacefulness and democracy. And that same thing, when putting Ukraine on the path to EU membership, would establish these same things, showing that Ukraine's government is peaceful and a democracy, making sure that it's not on a global scale. So we can look to this example that Crimea actually sets currently a dangerous precedent. We can look to Sudetenland, which land, he couldn't be stopped. And by putting Ukraine on the path to EU membership, we make sure that we show Putin that he can and will be stopped, showing that he can essentially go on the same path that Hitler did once again. It says a final signal to Russia to stop bullying. Yes, sir, wouldn't you agree?
How will your military as EU defend Ukraine if you don't have an army?
That's exactly what we're going on our second point. Ukraine has already used this NATO card, ensuring that the military of NATO, the military of the European Union, they're going to be a formidable opposition to Russia's bullying. We're showing them that they have to get up from their strong horse, their high horse, showing that the West is willing to militarily back Ukraine. And this, because Russia's currently roaring, they're bullying Ukraine, will put an end to this. However, it's not just the conflict that we need to be crushed. We also need to see the abolition of abuse to these workers. Wouldn't you agree?
Why would NATO intervene in a state where they don't have that particular interest?
They already have. Ukraine's already pulled the NATO card. This is already in action currently. In fact, what we need to look is to a bigger issue, the abuse that's happened to workers. Because right now, the unfortunate fact is that a lot of worker rights in Ukraine are virtually non-existent. For workers to see equal pay, for them to see a proper working condition, this is unheard of due to the horrible working rights in the nation as a whole. This is mainly due to the lack of advocacy boards there. The unions of Ukraine are so binded by many constraints and regulations that they don't have the opportunity to advocate for themselves. In fact, this has proven to be really detrimental to their worker rights as a whole. Because right now, in order for a union to be recognized as a union and to start the process, they have to at times go up to talk to 10 different entities, pay extraneous fees, making sure that this is an artificial barrier to unions succeeding, an artificial barrier for Ukraine to see these basic working rights acknowledged. In fact, the Office for Child Rights in Ukraine only has 7 employees. And these 7 employees aren't even doing their job properly. Because right now, all labor in Ukraine, or 30% of labor in Ukraine, is done by kids that are 14. So roughly a third of all their labor is done in these bad working conditions for children. This is clearly an abuse, not of worker rights, but it's human rights as well. And this needs to be fixed. It's not only this, not only the human rights issue, or the worker rights issue, but it's also human trafficking, or the buying and selling of people as if they were human commodities. Unfortunately, in the past 9 months alone, over 442 men and women alike have been trafficked in Ukraine because of this lack of regulation. And that's what the European Union will fix. They're making sure that we strive to see all of these people see basic human rights, so that they see equal pay, so that children are not forced into labor and they see good working conditions, so people aren't trafficked. And that's what the European Union is going to do. By simply putting it on the path to EU membership, we're ensuring that it will see a better tomorrow. In fact, Freedom House has a correlation. Some of the nation states that have the best workers' rights are generally in the European Union region. So by just setting them on the path to EU membership, Ukraine will see these same benefits. They will make sure that all these workers' rights will be in the benefit of the people. And as a result, it'll show that they are on the path not only to joining the European Union, but also on the path to making sure that the well-being of Ukrainians is fixed. And like Klisko said, we have to fight a different fight. We have to fight for democracy. We have to fight for equality. And setting Ukraine on the path to EU membership does just that. Not only crushes the current conflict, but it also helps us on another level, abolishing the enormous amount of human rights that go on Ukraine. Something that we need to look at in order to make sure that Ukraine has a future in the European Union.
I'd like to thank Tiana for her speech, and I invite Manuel. Okay, to start the case with the opposition.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. Speaker. Today's motion implicates not only choosing between Russia and EU for Ukraine. This motion implies such huge circumstances that are on the verge of the Third World War. And this is why this House does not approve that Ukraine should be sent to full membership of EU. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to first go through the rebuttal of what was said in the side of the opposition. Then I'm going to put my first argument, which is huge potential for disaster, where I will actually stronger our rebuttal points. And on the second argument will be presented by Tim in the second speech of the opposition, which is economical point. First of all, what the side of proposition is saying to us is Okay, they're implementing some kind of a model. We don't have a problem with technicalities of the problem. We have of the value of the model that we don't think it should be implemented at all. And that is why what I'm going to firstly talk about is their first argument, which is crushing of the conflict. First, they're saying that the current government is struggling to get legitimacy, but it is good seal and they want democracy. But what I would like to ask them is, where is the legitimacy of that government? Because that government has not been on polls, it hasn't been elected, and why that government has the legitimacy to do certain things, it hasn't been implemented. And the second thing, even if they do have legitimacy, this House sees a very big problem with that type of government. Why? Because it is extremely right option. And when they're saying they want to fight for democracy, it is something that the side of opposition does not believe in. Why? Because there is that extremely right option, and we think that that option is not currently doing sufficiently enough to increase the amount of democracy that is. And we think, no thank you, that EU should not be the one who will set on the road to full membership. The second thing they're saying is that the Putin will be stopped and the crime thing, which is the exact thing that Hitler is doing. First of all, about the crime point, Crimea point, we are saying that that point is completely legitimate. Why? Because 96% of the people living there have voted in favor of being part of Russian Federation. That is why, no thank you, that is why that 96% is hugely important, and that was that democracy they're fighting for, because that was the democratical way of how they want to be a part of another nation, and nobody here could stop that, because it is a part of even UN's policy or values that they're implementing, that every autonomous region could have, when doing something on referendum should be done. No thank you. And they're saying Putin will be stopped. But Putin, under today's circumstances, cannot be stopped, as they are saying. Well, even Putin yesterday said in his speech that a message, and I quote, that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine have always been a motherland, and they will stay like that. And when he can say these things, it does not mean that West society can stop him, and I want to know how will they stop. Then they're saying about NATO and how NATO will intervene. First of all, Ukraine is not a part of NATO, and NATO won't intervene here in this situation because they don't want conflict with Putin and what is actually happening. They're saying then that the labor rights will be progressed and the child rights will be progressed and everything else. But we see today that they have bad economy, they have bad status, and they are not solving their issues. So even if that government they're saying is doing something good, why are they not fixing this problem of trying to implement those labor rights? And that is why we find it problematic. Yes?
How do you say that we're not implementing these labor rights when exactly putting them on the path to EU membership does that? If your government is democratic government, why are they not doing it on their own? Why should we set them on EU path? And that exactly brings me. To my first argument, which is huge potential for disaster, and why EU should not set Ukraine on the road to full membership. First of all, as I've already said, we are on the verge of huge danger. Situation has gone so far. We cannot make it better anyhow for Ukraine. But what we can do is to stop and to prevent EU doing something that will be much worse than it is right now. The historical root of every conflict is pattern that which is always showing again and again and again. And what is happening here? That the West and the East are confronting on Ukraine because of pretensions towards them, and this is what we find problematical. And this is a good soil, to have a huge conflict that could be implemented on the whole world and the whole world scale. Another thing that we are saying is we are protecting EU and their integrity.
Why? Because EU has a problem. With disintegration and of their borders. Today, even on their borders, that is already happening. That this disintegration, like Venice today, Flandria, or Scotland, or other countries. So that disintegration, EU does not want another disintegrated country between East and West, between West who is pro-European and between East who is pro-Russian, and West who is pro-European. So another thing is that conflicts between the whole world, any decisions on Ukraine that happens will influence the whole world. And why is Ukraine in the same situation? Because Ukraine has undefined region of multiple ethnicities. And this is why Ukraine is special, because it is a tampon zone between the former USSR and the West, and has been throughout the whole history. Ukraine is on a place full of pretensions towards its territory. And historically seen, they will create artificial borders, and EU intervenes Ukraine with artificial borders, and whenever in history it happens that you create artificial borders, you're creating a good soil for boom, actually, to have an incredible impact. You can have war on this sort of impacts, you could have everything which is not good for that country. Every situation should be dealt on its own. This is what we believe is true. We should let Ukraine to determine by itself what their future will be. Not EU that has to implement some policies to make it happen, but Ukraine should be the one who will self-determine their future. And this is what actually are principles of European Union. This is something which is always, when you have compromise of pretensions, what happens is like Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have wars and conflicts or something like that. That analysis will be further explained in the second speech. And history always repeats what we say. And we think that when taking risk, it has to be good. We should only do it when we know Ukraine will benefit from taking that risk. But we haven't seen in any example of the side of proposition how Ukraine will benefit. And if there is a chance for Ukraine to be safe, EU should not do it. EU should not be the one who will enforce it. We have to have that self-determination that is part of it. For the sake of a safer society in Ukraine, for the sake of safer society in the whole world, this House opposes.
Okay, right to thank Manuel, and invite Lily to continue the case for the government.
Integration with the European Union is a desire that unites the Ukrainian people and solves some of the largest problems plaguing Ukraine. If the European Union wants to be on the right side of history, it will keep Ukraine's future in the EU alive by putting it on the path to membership, something it has already endorsed. In today's speech, I will go over side opposition's argument, return on to defend side proposition's first two arguments, and explain the third reason why the EU should set the Ukraine on the road to membership, because it would energize the Ukrainian economy. The single argument that side opposition provides to you in their speech is that we're actually going to exacerbate conflict in the region if we put Ukraine onto the path to EU membership. They say that this East-West conflict is what's historically started war in Europe. However, they seem to have forgotten about what started both World War I and World War II, which is particularly important when they're trying to draw a comparison to World War III. The way those wars started was by territorial acquisition that was illegal. Europe said that they shouldn't stop Hitler from taking over the Sudetenland because it would create more conflict. It wasn't worth it and start a regional war. Well, guess what? When they appeased Hitler because they were so scared of him, that's what started World War II, as he was on the warpath and took more land and more land. We are telling Vladimir Putin in Russia that it's okay to invade Ukraine if the European Union doesn't take a strong stance. And that strong stance is putting Ukraine on the path to EU membership. Because as Bruce Jones, a military expert at the Brookings Institution, explains, the budget of NATO, who has a military partnership with the European Union, is $190 trillion, compared to the military budget of Russia at $90 billion. He explains that because Russia knows it would be defeated by the European Union and NATO's military, who would defend Ukraine on the path to membership, Russia would completely stop trying to grab more territory. Yes.
Why exactly do you believe that NATO would intervene in a state that is not even a member state of the NATO Pact?
Because NATO has an agreement with the European Union to cooperate with it militarily. If Ukraine was on the path to the EU would ask NATO to help. They try to say that the European Union has problems with integration and doesn't want Eastern countries to be part of it. However, Eastern European countries and Central European countries like Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, and Slovakia have all had success in the European Union, and the EU has expressly explained that it wants to bring the East and West together by having all of their countries in the European Union, and these countries have succeeded in the EU. And finally, they try to tell you that creating these artificial borders is bad. First of all, the European Union isn't the one who decided the borders of Ukraine. That's something that was decided long ago. And they would help to make sure that there isn't ethnic conflict in the country, because Russia uses ethnic differences as a tool to stoke conflict. They've done it again and again in former Soviet republics, claiming they're trying to protect Russian groups and turn them against the other ethnic groups, only to create instability to gain land and resources. Instead, the European Union has worked in countries where there are ethnic differences to put in place representative democracies. So the voices of all ethnic groups are heard, and conflict is taken out of the ballot box, not with guns on the streets. Now, moving on to side proposition's argument. Our first argument is that you're going to crush both internal conflict as well as conflict with Russia if you put Ukraine on the path to membership. They say that we shouldn't legitimize the government right now because it isn't legitimate, because it wasn't democratically elected. However, what side opposition forgets is that that's how revolutions happen. Someone has to overthrow the authoritarian oppressive government in the first place, and it doesn't happen at the ballot box because authoritarian governments aren't democratic. This new government has said it will hold elections by the end of May, an extremely fast turnaround time. Yes?
Was Yanukovych's government legitimate?
No, because there was so much corruption and ballot box stuffing, and he stopped meeting the demands of the people, he was no longer considered a legitimate leader. And this is the government who is freeing the Ukrainian people from the oppression of authoritarianism, something that the European Union and the world should endorse because it's protecting these people's human rights. He says that Russia has a legitimate claim to the Crimea because of the elections. However, voting at gunpoint is not the same as free voting. There was widespread belief that Russia rigged these elections. They're not really doing it to help the people of Crimea. They're doing it because Russia wants more territory to put the former Soviet Union back together. Also, we go on to explain in our second argument, we explain that the workers' rights will be protected by the European Union. Their only argument is that, well, if the government hasn't done this now, why are they going to do it in the future? The reason the government hasn't made huge changes is because it's only been in place a couple of months. It needs the European Union's guidance to fulfill its promises that it will protect human rights and workers' rights, something it's repeated again and again that it wants to do. It just doesn't know how. Fortunately, the European Union does. The final reason that Ukraine should be set on the path to EU membership is because it energizes the Ukrainian economy. Ukraine's economy has been struggling for years, but EU membership would help it to become more stable. Right now, Ukraine's economy is currently unstable because Yanukovych's government didn't put in place any reform, was highly corrupt, and there is almost no foreign investment. In fact, some have worried about the government's budgetary problems. Clearly, Ukraine needs someone to help get their economic house in order, and they have two options. They can turn to the West for help or to their neighbors from the East. And Ukraine has already made their decisions that they want the European Union's help, as they've asked the EU to help them and explained that they will leave the Commonwealth of Independent States, the economic agreement with Russia. However, if the EU turns its back on Ukraine, and Ukraine has already left the CIS, it has to go crawling back to Russia, begging for help to keep its economy alive. At which point, Vladimir Putin can put any abusive restrictions he wants on what Ukraine has to do to be part of Russia's economy, and Russia gets a huge new country full of natural resources and other preventive benefits, allowing the European Union to essentially give Ukraine to Russia, feeding the Russian war machine, and forcing Ukraine into a bad situation. However, the European Union can prevent all of this by helping Ukraine, by putting it on the full road to membership. What happens when this takes place is that the European Union helps the new government put in place massive amounts of economic reform that make the government more competitive. Whenever a country starts to apply for EU membership, because it becomes so globally competitive, it's increased exports, which increases GDP,
Madam
putting more money in the pockets of everyday Ukrainians. Also, the European Union would help Ukraine to start cutting its budget, so it never gets in a situation in which its budget deficit is so high that it has to default. In the past, when countries in devastating economic situations, similar to those of Ukraine, like Slovakia and Bulgaria, joined the European Union, they saw a huge increase in their economic wealth and stability. However, countries who have been part of the Commonwealth of Independent States, like Russia and Ukraine, have only regressed. Thus, the European Union can avoid fortifying a rival economically by allowing Ukraine to turn to the West, not the East, and allow Ukraine to receive help from a union that isn't abusive and is looking out for the interests of Ukrainian people. Thus, because we prevent a regional war, or potentially even World War III by putting Ukraine onto the path to membership, we protect the people of Ukraine from workers' rights abuses, and we help the Ukrainian economy to grow in a healthy and free way. It's clear that if the European Union wants to be on the right side of history, it will continue to put Ukraine on the full road to membership.
Thank you for a speech. And now invite Ken to review the case for the opposition.
What the side proposition is doing in this debate today is misunderstanding a question that can lead to global conflicts. Misunderstand a question that can lead to diplomatic crisis under the pretense that they actually understand what they're talking about. And in the process, making completely naive statements, completely misunderstanding the history and politology behind this whole situation. And as a second speaker of the side opposition, I'm going to show you how exactly. First, I'm going to show you that this whole naive story about the Ukrainians being united in the quest for democracy is not quite true, and what the situation in Ukraine actually is, and what this government actually is like. Afterwards, I'm going to tell you about more about how conflicts start, where they start, and about other buffer zones in the world that have been created in the same way as Ukraine has, and have had conflicts up to this day today, and still do have conflicts today. And I'm going to talk to you about why NATO will not intervene in Ukraine. And afterwards, I'm going to clash the third point about economy with other point about economy to explain that there will be no economic boom. Even worse, there will be only negative, adverse consequences for the European Union and for Ukraine. Let us begin. The first thing they tell us, the Ukrainian people are united. That is a false statement. The Ukrainian people are not united. The Ukrainian people are divided between the Tatars, the Ukrainian people are divided between pro-Western citizens who support the European Union and pro-Russian citizens who have an extremely strong lobby in Kharkov, in Donetsk, and we see that days and days repeatedly have the buildings of the government in Donetsk, for example, being occupied by pro-Russian protesters and Russian flags being placed on the buildings in Donetsk. And even if statistically there is less people supporting Russia, the Eastern Ukrainian lobby is still a strong lobby, and a lobby that is willing to fight for, as Putin says, Mother Russia. A lobby that is willing to enter into conflicts. And after the Crimean question, where we had soldiers wounded in Simferopol, we had clashes in Sevastopol between pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian citizens, we have seen that Ukraine is prone to these clashes. Ukraine is prone to disintegrating from within. No, thank you, if you do not let the situation resolve by itself. Because the first principle in which a state decides what it is and what they are, and whether they are Ukrainians or Russians, is self-determination. And it's exactly these historical pretenses of Russia and of the European Union, constant territorial pretenses on Ukraine and other buffer zones, that have stopped the Ukrainians from developing their own identity. Especially because we claim that Ukraine isn't simply an artificial state created as nothing but a buffer zone. Go ahead.
So the best way of creating a Ukrainian identity would be to allow them to elect their own new government, right?
We do not oppose the election of a new Ukrainian government. We support the election of a new Ukrainian government. We oppose Ukraine entering the European Union as long as there is a chance of conflicts. We believe there is a chance of conflicts because the context of Ukraine goes far beyond this story. It enters into the context of the militarization of Poland, of military airplanes being sent to Belarus, of the militarization of Serbia and Moldova, of the geostrategical pretext of controlling the Bosphorus. It also enters the amount of conflicts that have arisen at the same time as the Ukrainian conflict, for example, Israel declared war on Iran. So there are a lot of conflicts in this context, and this is how conflicts historically start. So we're not necessarily saying that there will be a World War III because of Ukraine going to the European Union, but what we do say is that conflicts will start. And as we said, an excellent example of this is Bosnia and Herzegovina, because Bosnia and Herzegovina was not created as a state of an identity, as a state for a people. It was created as a state that was a compromise of pretenses. There were too many pretenses on the Croatian side, too many pretenses on the Serbian side. And we needed to create something in the middle that's going to no thank you, stop these pretenses from being executed in real life. But what happens in Bosnia and Herzegovina is it's an unstable state without an actual constitution and a state that is constantly being on the verge of civil war. Because historical conflicts are always revitalized over and over again. And we must point out the similarity between the Dayton Agreement and the Budapest Memorandum, because both these agreements pledge to protect the territorial wholesomeness of a single territory. Why do they do this? Because this territory cannot protect its own wholesomeness, because it does not have an identity upon which it stands. And the national grid has seen fit to make a desperate measure to protect these territories because they know their borders are artificial. And we believe that it is not beneficial for the European Union to have a state that may disintegrate from within, that is already a house divided against itself. This cannot aid the European Union. This is something that can only create conflicts because we are aggravating the pro-Russian community, and only then will Putin react. And as long as Putin claims that Ukraine is his mother, and Putin will not stop. He has not stopped in South Ossetia, he has not stopped in Abkhazia. Putin does not stop, no thank you, and Putin has no problems with jeopardizing someone else's sovereignty simply because he has interests. Now, as for the intervention of NATO, well, Ukraine is not a NATO member, and currently the world doesn't have much interest in militarily engaging Russia. No thank you, because militarily engaging Russia would mean actually materializing what the Cold War has been all up to today and actually creating World War II. And what we also want to tell you is that the European Union does not have anything to do with the borders of Ukraine, okay, but the borders of Ukraine are artificial, and the European Union needs stable borders. Borders that are not stable can threaten the European Union, especially because it's threatened by disintegration from within. No, thank you. Now, what they're telling us more about this government and how good it is. This government has taken away minority rights to their own languages. This government is openly fascist. This government has taken upon themselves the icon of Stepan Bandera, a fascist collaborator in World War II, as their icon. This government has prevented Vitaly Klitschko from achieving a high position in government because he was not supportive of the extreme right option. They're just as authoritarian as any other government in Ukraine, and therefore we believe that they should not have legitimacy. Now, as for the point that they have mentioned about the economy, and I'm going to clash this directly with our point about the economy and about how the economy will not prosper. They have told us that Ukraine has no foreign investors, but you know there is a reason for this. And the reason for this is that Ukraine is an extremely indebted country. Ukraine has billions and billions of debts it cannot pay off. No thank you. The European Union cannot afford another Greece, another country that is close to bankruptcy, another country whose debts it has to pay off, necessarily has to pay off. The European Union cannot hold this economically and does not want to. Because what's in it for the European Union? Why would the European Union invest in a country that cannot reciprocally contribute to the European Union? Well, let's face the truth. The European Union is not an altruist organization that does something because they're good at heart. Every single political decision in the world is made because there is a strategical interest. No thank you. And unless they prove this strategic interest, unless they prove there's something in it for the European Union, they cannot prove anything. And until there's nothing in it for the European Union, Ukraine may have had potential, but Ukraine is in such debts and their economy has so gone awry that it cannot be revitalized. And we also mentioned Ukraine does not even have a fully capitalist system, does not even have a fully free market, and we're completely engulfed by the market of Russia. So let's imagine what's going to happen when we put them on the European Union market, the free market, the competitive market, and what, for example, the French and German markets are going to do to Ukraine. How Ukrainian products are going to turn markets that are far more competitive. Ukraine is going to be completely engulfed by the European market. And if there was any spare chance of saving Ukraine from falling economically, this chance will no longer be there. And therefore, there are no benefits for the European Union and no benefits for Ukraine. And if there's no solution both sides, then there is no solution at all. And we show that the government is not legitimate because it's showing you that the people are not united. Because it's showing you that conflicts can and will appear in zones that are created as buffer zones because they have no real identity standing behind them. Because historically, these conflicts appear and Ukraine is prone to disintegration, and conflicts are in a much bigger context, and because there will be no achievement in workers' rights or whatever, because if the government is as good, then they can implement workers' rights themselves, but they do not because they are fascist. We beg you to oppose this motion. Thank you.
to making a case for the government.
Just like Klitschko used to fight against others in boxing matches, now today he fights for something different. He fights for democracy. And in the same way, Team Proposition does this. We fight for new democratic values, and Team Opposition has agreed over and over again. The way that we solve harms or find a solution to the harms that could be created by Russian retaliation is through having better leaders. This is not a recreation of Bosnia. Rather, we're not fighting with guns. We're fighting with democratic leaders that promote solutions to the problems that currently exist. The three main areas of clash in today's debate is first, conflict, second, economy, and lastly, abuse. We are winning on every single level. And remember, the model of Team Proposition is that we are allowing for a slow joining of the EU. In other words, we will always allow Ukraine to be able to have the right to apply for membership, which means that we will begin to find a solution for the harms that are outlined by Team Opposition in today's debate. And here's how. And here's how we meet our burden of benefiting the well-being of Ukrainians. 3 ways. First, let's take a look at conflict. Team Proposition has brought up over and over again how we have really an increase in the amount of conflict in terms of the opposition's world because we don't decrease the deterrence. Team Proposition allows for an idea of deterrence because whenever the EU and Ukraine are united and Ukraine has its membership or is on the path to membership, that joining will create deterrence against Russia. In other words, since the EU has ties with NATO, the EU will call up NATO whenever Russia wants to invade. And remember, just as we stated against Team Opposition's point and has not been argued against, that NATO has $190 trillion developed into their military, whereas Russia has a mere 90 million. These numbers simply outweigh each other, or rather 190 million compared to the 90 million. Those numbers show that Russia will take that whenever they fight against another entity such as NATO, and in the same way, it proves that the retaliation will be taking on back, or on the back burner. There are other arguments on our points is that first, the Ukrainian people are divided right now between pro-Western and pro-Russian. But the point with this is that more support for Russia does not mean less support for democracies, less support for abuses of human rights, and less support for a better economy. That is not shown by Team Opposition, whereas it is shown within Team Proposition. What do you have to say against that?
Aren't you contradictory because you're saying that Russia is stopping democracy in Ukraine, but now you say that being pro-Russian does not necessarily mean being against democracy?
No, I'm saying that whenever we allow for a path to EU membership, that will create ties and allow for democratic values because that is a part of the membership process. And that will allow for them to be able to have these elections like they're already going to have in May. Whereas if they go towards Russia, if they go towards the east, that only means that it creates more dependency upon Russia, which sucks out the life of Ukraine. The EU does not do that, and Team Proposition does not do that. But what's even more is that their second argument on this point is that it will only decrease the amount of self-determination, or rather that Ukraine needs to have their own self-determination in order to promote a better solution to these harms. There's no self-determination whenever Ukraine is being sucked into Russia and allowing for Russia to try to recreate the Soviet Union. That does exact opposite. We are not creating self-determination, rather we are decreasing it. Only EU membership or the path to EU membership will allow for Ukraine to be able to get back on its feet, be able to have a democratic leader, be able to have less rights abuses, and be able to have a better economy. That is what creates self-determination of Ukraine, not dependency on Russia. And that's the first reason why Team Proposition meets their burden of how we benefit the well-being of Ukraine, because we decrease the conflict, we deter the conflict. Whereas in the world of the opposition, they only allow that retaliation to continue. The second point being about the economy. Whereas Team Opposition continues to have great rhetoric whenever it comes to the economy, they simply have no point. And that is continually shown over and over again, whereas Team Proposition does. We energize the Ukrainian economy because whenever we allow for ties between the EU and Ukraine, that means that it allows for the increase of exports and the increase of imports between the two. Whereas Russia cannot allow this. Russia does not have huge benefits. We can't feed the Russian war machine. Rather, what we need to do is allow for the EU to be able to help the Ukraine in the same way that they've done in the past. They misunderstand understand this and say that all we will be doing is allowing for Russia to be able to lock this state out of debt, and Russia is the only one that can allow for the Ukraine to get out of its debt, and that the EU cannot do this. The EU is not paying off their debt, rather they're creating reforms. They're implementing the base mindset that we need to cut back on our spending and we need to have better economic policies. That is exactly what Team Proposition has brought up over and over again, and what Team Opposition fails to argue. Do you have an argument now?
Yes, we do, because what is the interest of EU? What kind of export will you have if Ukraine is constantly in debt and cannot be better?
They will no longer be in debt if they start to increase the amount of exports and imports that are between the EU and the Ukraine. You probably just didn't listen to the past minute of my speech. But remember, this means that we increase the amount of allowance of a better economy, we fuel that economy, we energize the economy, whereas Russia only creates dependency and sucks the life out of the Ukrainian economy. So this is the second reason for why Team Proposition meets our burden of how we benefit the well-being of Ukrainians, and how Team Opposition only does the opposite, which is a reason for why they ought to lose this debate. The last argument being of abuse. This point has been largely not argued against in terms of this debate, and is probably one of a very important amount. While Team Opposition wants to throw out great rhetoric about how we're only allowing for a World War III, rather they're decreasing and not looking to the real abuses that happen on a day-to-day level in the Ukraine. Those abuses being between individual workers, between those people who are children, and allowing for human trafficking in the future. Remember, we brought up how there are only 7 workers in Ukraine that are trying to fight back against harms, against abuse towards workers, whereas they're not doing anything against that. We create and we decrease the amount of human trafficking. 442 people were human trafficked in the past year alone, children, women, and men alike, sexually abused and thrown into that system. That's not something that we ought to allow. Those type of impacts outweigh the impacts that Team Opposition can bring up. Even if they argue that we can help the economy just a little bit in terms of the world of the opposition, that does not outweigh abuses constantly, daily, happening over and over again to women, children, and men. This creates a cycle of dependency upon those workers, a cycle of re-entrenching their harms. They're constantly being more dependent upon their hirers, and they only are abused more and more. So we also benefit Ukrainians on a day-to-day level by decreasing the amount of abuse, and we fulfill their promises by the EU. This is how we meet our burden of benefiting Ukrainians on 3 levels. First, we decrease the conflict. We create that deterrence. Second, we energize the economy, whereas they're only harming the economy because Russia only sucks the Ukraine back into dependency over and over again by recreating the Soviet Union. And lastly, by decreasing abuse, something that Team Opposition has not paid any lip service to. If the EU wants to be on the right side of history, it will put the Ukrainians' future back into a possibility of being alive.
Thank you, Shania, for her speech. And now invite Dina to close the case for the opposition.
Let's say the title of my talk would be, Let's Get Real. And I want to get real in this debate on 3 levels. First of all, I would like to get real on the situation currently happening in Ukraine. Then I'd like to get real in the economic point of view. Thirdly, I would like to argue why human rights are not going to be better, even if the situation with the European Union and the path for membership will be perfect. And then I would like to emphasize that the proposition side never actually shown us why the European Union would do this. In other words, they haven't shown the benefits for the EU, why they would even accept and fully contribute to the Ukraine. So let's get started with my speech. First of all, situation in Ukraine. What we hear from side proposition is a big ideal of democracy. We see big words, united, standing tall, standing proud, but this is not the situation in Ukraine. You don't have 100% or 98% of people that are Ukraine and are for democracy and are standing together in order to make Ukraine better. You have a lot of division between them. You have Tatars, you have people who are pro-Russian, pro-European. They are not bringing, they're not bringing them together. They're doing absolutely nothing to make them a union of Ukrainians. They're not making this situation any easy. the conflict that's going to be even bigger and even more serious, because if you push Ukraine on the road to EU, the pro-Russian side is going to bring even more demonstrations, protests, and you're going to fully divide the country even more. And this is something that's not going to make Ukraine stable. It's not going to further human rights. It's not going to further their economy. It's just going to be worse, and the conflicts are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're making a war zone in the middle of Europe. No, thank you. On the point of NATO being able to make some impact in Ukraine, we say no on two levels. First of all, European Union on itself doesn't have an army, so European Union as itself can't and is not in a position with manpower to intervene in Ukraine's situation. But furthermore, NATO as a world army is also not ready to have its impact in Ukraine, because if they really are ready to start a war there, we ask you to analyze this, and this hasn't been analyzed in the debate, whereas we have proven that this is not the first time Russia has taken a territory. For example, in Georgia, people did nothing. The whole world watched and was silently not approving what is happening, but Russia still holds two provinces of Georgia. And this is what the world does. The world is not ready to react on Putin, and they haven't shown us why would the world be ready to react. So we say, if you do this, you will further deepen the conflict of the Ukrainian people, and you don't have manpower that's going to stop this conflict from being worldwide. No, thank you. Second of all, the economy. They say, and this is really a great ideal they're fighting for, but unfortunately isn't real. They say they can increase export and it's going to be better. But we ask you, what export? What are they going to export? What kind of economy do they have right now that could benefit the European Union? What kind of products do they have that could actually be competitive on the European market? Because the European market is larger and more competitive than the Russian market. Ukrainian people do not have any chance to fight in that market, and their economy would actually be worse. And there are no investments. There are no investments because the debt of Ukrainian people is billions and billions of dollars. And European Union doesn't have an interest of having another Greece, another Portugal, another Italy, another Spain. European Union itself cannot support one more country that has nothing to give to European Union. And this has also not been answered in this debate. Yes, please.
Isn't not having Russia acquire more and more territory and pose a threat to Europe a benefit for the EU?
No, it is not, because it is only a cost to European Union. Because for it to be a benefit, Ukraine has to give something to European Union. But European Union would only gain more debts and more conflicts that it would have to take care of, which would also need more money, more diplomatic missions, and so on. So there is actual no benefits that Ukraine could bring to European Union, which was not proven in the debate. No, thank you. Furthermore, I would like to go to the human rights points. They say that the day-to-day level of abuse of human rights is present in Ukraine. But we ask you, how are you going to change this? If this current government is openly fascist and openly abolished Klitschko in the government because he is not as far right-wing as they are, then how are you going to change the situation for human rights? How are you going to change human traffic? How are you going to change workers' rights abuse? They are openly fascist and do not care about these things. And you haven't shown us by simply putting Ukraine on a road to full membership changes these things. Just by putting it and saying, okay, you now may have a chance to become a European Union member state, does not change the abuse of rights that is happening in Ukraine right now. And there was no analysis from the side of proposition that could tell us otherwise. And no, thank you. To end my speech at this point, as I have said during my speech, they haven't shown us why European would do so. Why European Union, no thank you, would let them have another burden on their budget, another billion of debt account, another conflict war, another, no thank you, another situation that they have to deal with in the times when we see rising up again. No thank you. With their lack of analysis, the only thing they managed to prove is that European Union and the world itself is on the verge of another war. And by dealing with this in such a naive way, we are only risking to make the situation worse and to be back again in 1945. No thank you. So, to sum up my speech, I would like to get real on the side of opposition. I would like to tell you that by not understanding the situation in Ukraine, they're making things worse. They're deepening the conflicts that are already existent in this country, because this country has always been treated as a buffer zone between East and the West. By that, in that manner, this country has always been pulled by one side to another side, and they're not dealing with this situation in the right way. They're not helping Ukraine to be stable by itself, so that stable by itself it can compete to the European Union and to Russia. It is not stable enough to exist on its own. And by not existing on its own, it's not helpful to the European Union, and the European Union does not have any benefits from including Ukraine in their circle. So, because of all these reasons, because with their naivety might lead us to the World War III, I beg you to oppose this motion.
Okay. Thank you for the speech, and now I think for the reply.
Naivety and categorical statements is what the side opposition has decided to base their decision concerning a diplomatic crisis on. And we find this to be problematic. And therefore, I'm going to give a reply to what they have said by giving a guideline through all their mistakes, through all their fallacies, through all their categorizations, and show you why you should never judge on such argumentation. Now, the first thing that they tell us is there will be democracy. This government is struggling to gain legitimacy, and they are puzzled by that. What they have neglected is the fact that the government is fascist. What they have neglected is the fact that the government takes fascist collaborators as the icons of their movement. What they have neglected is that this government has destroyed the rights of minorities in Ukraine. This government is doing exactly what the international community tells governments not to do. And therefore, this government is illegitimate by the standards of the international community. But they have ignored this. They have said this government is democratic and there will be democracy. The second thing that they have told us is if Ukraine's economy will be better, it just will, and things will happen. They have not, in a single way, told us why. We have told you that no one has an interest investing in a country that is billions and billions in debt, investing in a country whose industry is 40 years behind its time, investing in a country that doesn't even have a capitalist economy, investing in a country that still has oligarchs. The European Union still has already has enough countries who are in such a situation, and already has enough countries who are dissatisfied with such a situation. Not only that, but they have neglected the fact that Ukraine is a house divided inside itself. Putin claiming Ukraine for himself does not mean starting World War II. It means that the Ukrainian people have decided that Russia is their motherland. However, Ukraine being integrated to the European Union does pose a risk of conflict for the European Union, because suddenly inside your borders you have a country that is prone to a conflict between two types of people, two different identities who are protected by proxies on both sides. So the only potential for conflict that you create is when you integrate Ukraine and the European Union, not when you allow the Ukrainian people to self-determine and the situation to crystallize for itself. Another thing they have ignored is that, you see, the economy and workers' rights, etc., do not come by themselves. If there is really such a movement for democracy in Ukraine, then movements should already have been made. If not, why would the European Union be fighting on the principle of manifest destiny, trying to bring something to a country that's already fallen economically, fallen on their very genesis, because their genesis is artificial. They were not created as a nation of the Ukrainian people, and the Ukrainian people have far less legitimacy than the Russian people historically. It was created as an artificial buffer zone between the West and the East, and always remains so. It has failed in its very creation. It has failed economically, it has failed politically, it is failing now in this supposedly legitimate government. So what's in for the European Union to play the great American eagle and to spread its wings over Ukraine when Ukraine itself has already fallen? This they cannot show us. They can simply claim that beautiful stuff is going to happen, and there are going to be flowers and unicorns, and there's going to be democracy, and there's going to be good economy, and there's going to be workers' rights. What they have ignored is the entire historical analysis and context behind this situation. The context that there are more and more conflicts in the world. The context of for example, the Security Council being called to decide upon the situation. These are events that precede diplomatic crisis. And these are events, if exaggerated, in only one single aspect, can lead to world conflicts. So if the status quo has not led to a world conflict, we should not exaggerate the status quo. Because history shows that exaggerating such conflicts will lead to even bigger conflicts. This they have not engaged on. They have engaged simply and solely on their own naivety. But the side of opposition does not support naivety. The side of opposition supports to being reasonable. And therefore, because of being reasonable and for the sake of common sense, I beg you to oppose my time.
Thank you for the speech, and now I invite Lily to close the Russia's call.
Today you have been presented two worlds, and the question that is important is in which world is the well-being of Ukrainians maximized? That's the burden the proposition proved for winning today's round. In the world of the opposition, they claim that because Ukraine is already in such a bad situation and it will be hard for it to ascend to the European Union, we should allow the Ukraine to collapse, costing the Ukrainian people, in some cases, maybe even their lives. In the world of the opposition, the European Union follows its same policy of appeasement it used to appeal to Hitler, to Vladimir Putin, allowing Russia anywhere in the world to acquire territory where ethnic Russians live in an excuse that it's protecting them. Instead, what it's doing is reamassing the Soviet Union and threatening the European Union's security, potentially starting another world war. In the world of the opposition, you don't have democracy, because that's not what a Russia influencing Ukraine wants. Instead, it will simply install another authoritarian leader that doesn't listen to the voice of any of the people, majority or minority. You also have hundreds of instances of human trafficking, workers' abuse, and child abuses, because Russia will do nothing to encourage the Ukraine to reform those problems. You also have a world in which ethnic conflict is solved with gunshots, not at the ballot box. And finally, you have the Commonwealth of Independent States influencing Ukraine's economy, not the European Union. And instead of reforming them, it's sucking its dry of its resources, pulling money and time of your workers' abuse out of the pockets of Ukrainian people, clearly not protecting any of their well-being. That's not reasonable. However, in the world of the proposition, you give the European Union security from Russia, which they've said they wanted by already inviting Ukraine to apply for membership. And you have a Ukraine that gains economic and governmental stability. In the world of the proposition, Russia is forced back onto the ropes because it knows that now Ukraine is part of the European Union, NATO will protect it with its life. And because Russia couldn't possibly fight the NATO military force, Russia will have to bring its military back to its own country, sulking away from a conflict and being reduced in power. That's a huge security benefit for Ukraine, the European Union, and the world. Also, you have an increase in democracy and human rights. Because let's actually get real. The government in Ukraine has gotten rid of all of its fascist elements and said it's going to hold democratic elections, but it needs the European Union's help to do so. Thus, ethnic minorities can hear their voices heard through their votes, not through forcing use gun violence on the streets. You also have a world where the European Union helps this government who said it wants to protect the human rights of its people by writing in place laws, as we explained earlier, that mean people have to be treated fairly. That's the most important part in today's round that they never responded to, is that people get their rights back in the Ukraine by ascending to the European Union. And economic reforms are put in place to make sure that Ukraine doesn't become the next Greece, Portugal, or Italy. Because in our model, as they never responded to, it has a long application process where all of these reforms are put in place so that the Ukrainian economy becomes competitive and develops an export industry. The European Union, thus, gives it the economic stability that allows it to be a member of the European Union without draining the EU's resources. And it also puts money back in the pocket of the Ukrainian people and of the Ukrainian government, something that is a huge benefit to the well-being of these people. Side proposition protects the rights of Ukrainians, the security of the European Union, and the strength of Ukraine's economy. Side opposition just gives outcome in Ukraine, saying it's a lost cause. Side proposition by allowing Ukraine full road to EU membership is not putting the European Union on the side of naivety, they're putting the European Union on the right side of history.
Thank you, Frank Levy, for his speech and all of you for the match. Please shake hands and leave the room. There is no feedback for this match, so please take your stuff with you.